Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. Sometimes the center governs farthest not by speaking loudest, but by controlling the routes, revenues, and supplies that others cannot live without. The puzzle is not just who prevailed, but how could a ruler control a distant region without the ability to enforce direct commands there? The pressure is immediate. At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because practical authority over distant regions may depend less on enforcing every direct order than on controlling the resource flows those regions need, making. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. How could a ruler control a distant region without the ability to enforce direct commands there? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when direct command becomes thin across distance, yet regions that appear politically loose may still remain tightly bound by fiscal dependence on the center. The pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and pure. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between authority exercised through immediate command and authority exercised through control of the resources that make local action possible. The pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is fiscal leverage as a substitute for direct command, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Fiscal leverage as an authority substitution mechanism. How taxation, tribute, and control of resource channels can bind distant regions to the center even where direct command is weak or slow. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. Practical authority over distant regions may depend less on enforcing every direct order than on controlling the resource flows those. The first point is that command is only one way to exercise authority, especially across large and diverse spaces. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Where direct enforcement is expensive or slow, rulers often rely on fiscal links that make distant actors depend on the center for continued stability. That is the mechanism. Taxes, tribute, route access, and protected exchange can all function as channels through which the center shapes local behavior without issuing constant detailed instruction. That is the mechanism. This works because resources influence what local elites, commanders, and communities can actually sustain over time. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A region may appear autonomous on the surface while still depending on central recognition of payments, redistribution, route security, or privileged access to trade. That is the mechanism. That dependence can discipline behavior quietly, because disobedience threatens material disruption rather than only formal punishment. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Fiscal leverage also helps the center govern through incentives, rewarding compliance with access and making defection more expensive in practical terms. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This does not make fiscal control gentle. It can be coercive, extractive, and deeply unequal even while it reduces the need for constant direct command. That is the mechanism. The mechanism therefore substitutes pressure through resources for pressure through immediate presence. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. That substitution is especially important where the center cannot cheaply station overwhelming force everywhere at once. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Yet fiscal leverage has limits. If extraction outruns reciprocity, local actors may stop reading the center as a source of order and start reading it as a drain worth resisting. So durable, fiscal authority requires some visible return, root security, redistribution, status, arbitration, or access that makes continued connection advantageous. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The strategic value lies in binding local calculation to central channels so that political distance does not become material independence too quickly. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A ruler who controls these channels can often steer distant behavior more effectively than a ruler who merely issues commands no one has reason to prioritize. That is the mechanism. The deeper question, then, is not whether command disappears, but whether material dependence has become the more durable language of authority. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A fair counterpoint is that some regions comply less because fiscal design is elegant, and more because military or geographic constraints leave few realistic alternatives. The limits still matter. The limitation is that fiscal leverage is difficult to separate fully from coercion, patronage, alliance, and local custom, all of which often operate together. The limits still matter. The mechanism fails when extraction becomes too visible, too uneven, or too detached from local benefit, turning dependence into grievance and grievance into revolt. The limits still matter. There is also an exception in wealthy or strategically isolated regions that can replace lost central channels more easily than the ruler expected. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate because resource control can stabilize rule while also preserving exploitation and unequal burden. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful, where the center controls decisive flows of revenue, movement, and redistribution. Distant actors often remain more governable than direct command models would predict. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Rulers control distant regions more effectively when they control the channels of revenue and access those regions depended upon, making resource leverage a durable substitute for constant direct supervision. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking which resources move through the center even when the center cannot move people everywhere equally fast. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, and fiscal institutions often keep distant regions inside the system long after direct command has thinned. Ask the structural question. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the issue becomes whether local autonomy still rests on channels the center can narrow, widen, or interrupt. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to taxation alone, because the leverage matters only when tied to roots, redistribution, or dependency that actors cannot cheaply replace. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that resource control can govern where direct command cannot easily reach. Ask the structural question. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether the center can rely on fiscal dependence strongly enough to preserve authority without extracting so heavily that the same dependence hardens into revolt. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.